Felix Jameson didn't expect to spend his Friday night lying on an emergency room gurney with a deep gash on his side. But here he was bleeding, irritated, and absolutely regretting the bar fight that had put him here. He'd only stepped in to stop some drunk guy from harassing a waitress, but the next thing he knew, a broken glass had slashed his ribs. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath as he pressed a hand against the wound. His white dress shirt was ruined, stained crimson, but he barely felt the pain. He had experienced worse. What really annoyed him was the fact that his driver had insisted on bringing him straight to the hospital instead of back to his penthouse. The curtain to his examination area yanked open, and suddenly the room didn't feel so dull anymore. A woman in a white coat stood before him, clipboard in hand, her dark brown eyes sharp and assessing. Her chestnut hair was tied into a loose ponytail, a few strands slipping free to frame her face. Felix had seen beautiful women before he dated supermodels, had drinks with actresses, but there was something about her that made the air in his lungs still. "I'm Dr. Callie Westwood," she said briskly, stepping closer. "Let's see how bad this is." Felix raised an eyebrow, more intrigued than concerned. "You don't waste time with pleasantries, do you, Doc?" She barely spared him a glance. "Not when a patient is bleeding on my table." "Shirt off." Felix huffed a small laugh but obeyed, unbuttoning his ruined shirt and shrugging it off. He caught the slight hesitation in her movements as her gaze flickered over his chest, toned from years of boxing, his tanned skin marred by a few scars from past injuries. Callie cleared her throat, snapping herself back to focus. "The wound isn't too deep, but you'll need stitches." "Great," Felix said, watching her as she pulled on gloves. "I was hoping for an excuse to see you again." "How many follow-ups will this require?" Callie ignored the flirtation and began cleaning his wound with practiced hands. "Just one, and don't try to charm your way into more appointments. I'm immune to that." Felix chuckled, wincing slightly as the antiseptic burned. "You wound me, Doc." "You did that to yourself," she shot back, threading the needle with precision. Felix watched her work, fascinated by her concentration. She was different from most women he met, unimpressed by his presence, unshaken by his teasing. It was refreshing. "So what happened?" she asked, keeping her focus on the stitches. "Some guy got aggressive with a waitress. I stepped in. He didn't appreciate that." Callie paused for half a second before continuing. "That was reckless," Felix shrugged. "It was the right thing to do." She glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was something there, something unreadable. "Still reckless," she murmured, finishing the last stitch. Felix grinned. "You care about me already, Doc." Callie rolled her eyes, removing her gloves. "Hardly, but I do care about keeping you out of my ER." She turned to dispose of the used materials, and Felix knew he should just let her do her job, take his discharge papers, and leave. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to. "Do you ever take a break from saving lives?" he asked casually. Callie arched an eyebrow. "Are you asking if I have time to entertain a millionaire with a hero complex?" Felix smirked. "I was going to say go out for dinner, but your version works too." She shook her head, suppressing a smile. "You should rest, no strenuous activity for a few days." Felix leaned back on the gurney, watching her with newfound intrigue. He had come in expecting nothing more than a quick fix-up. Instead, he was leaving with stitches and an undeniable interest in Dr. Callie Westwood. And for the first time in years, Felix Jameson found himself wanting to chase something that had nothing to do with business or wealth. He wanted her. Felix Jameson wasn't the type to let something or someone slip through his fingers, especially when his instincts told him there was more beneath the surface. And Dr. Callie Westwood. She was a mystery wrapped in a white coat, sealed with a stare that had challenged him more than anyone in recent memory. 2 days after his ER visit, he found himself standing outside a bustling cafe near the hospital, the smell of roasted coffee beans blending with the city air. He wasn't the kind of man who waited, but here he was, leaning against his sleek black sports car, watching the entrance like a hunter surveying his prey. Sure enough, right on schedule, Callie emerged, her hair pulled into a loose bun, a coffee cup in one hand, her phone in the other. She was mid-sentence, nodding at whatever the person on the other end was saying, but the moment she caught sight of him, her brows lifted in something between amusement and exasperation. She ended the call and approached him. "Tell me you didn't track my schedule just to stand out here looking smug," Felix grinned. "I prefer persistent." Callie took a slow sip of her coffee, studying him, "and I prefer not interested." "I don't believe that." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Let me guess. You have this whole thing planned out in your head. You charm me, I fall for you, and then what? You get bored." Felix tilted his head slightly. "That's a lot of assumptions, Doc." Callie folded her arms, unimpressed. "I've met your type before." That intrigued him even more. "And what type is that?" "The kind who thinks persistence equals entitlement," Felix chuckled. "I don't think I'm entitled to anything, but I do think you're intrigued, and that scares you." Callie's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes for the briefest second. "I don't have time for games," she said finally. "Good," Felix replied. "Neither do I." She huffed out a reluctant laugh. "You're impossible. And you're fascinating." Callie rolled her eyes but didn't walk away. Instead, she glanced at her watch. "I have exactly 10 minutes before I need to be back inside." Felix gestured toward a nearby bench. "Then let's not waste them." To his surprise, she moved toward the bench without another word, sitting with a sigh. He joined her, the space between them filled with the hum of passing cars and distant conversation. "What made you want to be a doctor?" he asked, breaking the silence. Callie arched a brow. "That's your opening question? Would you rather I ask something shallow?" She studied him for a long moment before answering. "I wanted to fix things, people. I like the idea of making a tangible difference in someone's life." Felix nodded, filing that away. "And do you still feel that way?" "Most days," she admitted. "And you, what made you want to be?" She gestured vaguely, as if unable to sum him up in one word. "A businessman," he offered. "Millionaire," she corrected. Felix let out a low chuckle. "Ah. So you did Google me." Callie didn't confirm or deny it. "Answer the question." He leaned back slightly. "I like control. I like knowing that whatever happens, I have the power to change it." She studied him again, as if peeling back layers. "That sounds exhausting." Felix's lips twitched. "And what about you, carrying the weight of people's lives every day?" Callie took another sip of coffee. "It's fulfilling." "But exhausting." She hesitated, then nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, an understanding settling between them. Callie glanced at her watch and stood. "Time's up." Felix stood too, hands in his pockets. "Dinner tonight." Callie exhaled, eyeing him. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Not when something's worth the effort." She hesitated, then finally gave him a small nod. "One dinner." Felix grinned. "I'll pick you up at 7. As she walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time in a long time he was chasing something that actually mattered. Felix arrived at Callie's apartment building precisely at 7, stepping out of the driver's side of his sleek black car. He rarely drove himself, but tonight was different. He had no intention of letting a chauffeur play middleman in what already felt like a delicate, unpredictable dance. The door to the building opened, and Callie stepped out. She was stunning in a fitted navy dress, the fabric hugging her figure just enough to make his pulse tick up a notch. Her hair was down this time, cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked put together, yet effortless, a contrast he found increasingly difficult to ignore. "You're punctual," she said, walking toward him. "I don't like to waste time." His gaze swept over her, appreciating the sight. "And tonight I have no intention of wasting yours." Callie tilted her head slightly, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "Let's see if you live up to that promise." He opened the car door for her, waiting as she slid inside before shutting it and moving to the driver's seat. As he pulled into traffic, she glanced at him. "So, where are we going?" "You'll see." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You do realize mystery only works if the other person actually enjoys surprises." Felix chuckled. "You'll like this one." She didn't argue, but he caught the way she tapped her fingers lightly against her thigh, a small tell that she wasn't entirely relaxed. He filed that detail away, adding it to the ever-growing list of things he wanted to learn about her. 15 minutes later, he pulled into a private entrance leading to a rooftop restaurant. The valet opened Callie's door, and as she stepped out, her gaze lifted to the softly lit terrace above them. Strings of lights glowed against the night sky, and inside, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a space that was intimate despite its luxury. Callie glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her expression. "You don't do simple, do you?" "I do what works," Felix said, offering his arm. For a brief second, she hesitated, then slid her hand through the crook of his elbow. They walked inside, and within moments, the maitre d' led them to a secluded table overlooking the city skyline. As they sat, Callie unfolded her napkin, her expression unreadable. "I have to admit, I expected something flashier. Exclusive club, maybe, something with a waiting list 2 years long." Felix leaned back in his chair. "I considered it, but I figured you'd appreciate good food more than a status symbol." Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to read her that well. Interesting assumption. Accurate, though. She didn't confirm or deny it, instead scanning the menu before setting it down. "You seem very confident in your ability to figure people out." "It's a skill that's served me well." Callie met his gaze. "And what happens when you're wrong?" Felix's mouth quirked slightly. "I don't often find myself in that position." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you don't." The waiter arrived, and they placed their orders. As soon as they were alone again, Callie studied him. "So, tell me something I don't already know about you." Felix considered her for a moment. "I almost didn't go into business." That caught her attention. "Really? I was supposed to follow in my father's footsteps, law, but I had no interest in arguing in courtrooms or playing politics." He took a sip of his drink. "I wanted control over my own future. Business gave me that." Callie nodded slowly. "And now you have everything you wanted." Felix set his glass down, tapping a finger lightly against the table. "Not everything." Something flickered across her face, but before she could respond, the waiter returned with their appetizers. They ate, conversation flowing easily between bites. For all her initial resistance, Callie had a sharp wit, a mind that challenged him in ways he wasn't used to. She didn't fawn over his success, nor did she seem particularly impressed by his wealth. It was refreshing. Halfway through the meal, she set down her fork. "I have a question." Felix gestured for her to continue. "Why me?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because you're not like anyone I've met before." Callie arched a brow. "That's a very rehearsed answer." Felix exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "Fine, because you don't care who I am, because when I walked into that ER, you didn't see a millionaire, you saw a man who needed stitches. Because you challenge me." For the first time that evening, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. Felix watched her carefully. "And maybe, just maybe, I like the way you make me work for your attention." A slow breath left her lips, and for a moment, she looked down at her plate as if collecting her thoughts. "That's unfair," she murmured. Felix cocked his head. "Why?" "Because I'm not looking for this, for whatever this is." He considered her words, then nodded. "Fair enough." Callie blinked as though surprised by his easy acceptance. "But," Felix continued, "you're here, which means part of you is curious." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You really don't give up." "I don't." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with something unspoken. Finally, Callie sighed. "Dinner's nice." Felix smiled. "That's a start." As the night wore on, she let herself relax just a little, and Felix, he found himself more determined than ever. He wasn't just interested in winning her over. He wanted to unravel every layer of the woman who had, against all odds, captured his attention. Felix hadn't expected one dinner to change everything. But as he walked Callie back to her apartment building that evening, he knew without question he wasn't letting this go. The streets were quieter now, the city humming with a softer energy. Felix kept his pace steady beside her, hands in his pockets, resisting the urge to reach for her. He could sense the shift in her. She was still guarded, but there was something else now. A crack in the wall she'd built between them. Callie exhaled, glancing sideways at him. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking." She arched a brow. "That sounds dangerous." Felix chuckled under his breath. "Only if you're afraid of where my thoughts might lead." She shook her head, but he caught the way the corner of her mouth twitched. He liked that how she fought so hard to keep him at arm's length, yet couldn't quite hide the way she was drawn to him. As they reached the entrance to her building, she hesitated, key in hand. Tonight was, Felix waited, watching her. Better than I expected, she admitted. He didn't hide his satisfaction. I'll take that as a win. Callie rolled her eyes but didn't move to go inside. Instead, she chewed on her lower lip as if debating something. Felix held his breath, waiting. Listen, she said, meeting his eyes. I meant what I said before. I wasn't looking for this. Felix nodded. I know, but she hesitated. I don't know. Maybe I don't have to have all the answers right now. Felix reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. Then don't. She let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Good night, Felix. Good night, Callie. She turned, unlocking the door and stepping inside, but just before it shut behind her, she glanced back one last time. It was brief, but Felix saw it. Hope, and that was all he needed. Days passed and something unspoken settled between them. Callie didn't push him away and Felix didn't let up. He sent her coffee when she had long shifts, left notes with the barrister at the cafe she always stopped at. Small things, thoughtful things. And Callie, despite her best efforts, stopped resisting quite so hard. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, she found herself standing outside her hospital, exhausted but restless. She wasn't sure why she pulled out her phone, even less sure why she called the one person who had been on her mind more than she wanted to admit. Felix answered immediately. Callie, she let out a breath. I don't know why I called. He didn't hesitate. Where are you? The hospital. Stay there, she frowned. Felix, that's not, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And then the line went dead. Callie stared at her phone, torn between frustration and something far more dangerous, anticipation. Exactly 10 minutes later, his car pulled up to the curb. He stepped out, dressed in a dark suit, looking like he had just walked out of a high-stakes meeting. Callie narrowed her eyes. Did you just leave something important for this? Felix shrugged. You called, that makes it important. Her chest tightened involuntarily. Felix. Get in the car, Callie. She hesitated, then finally exhaled and moved toward the passenger side. He drove in comfortable silence, the city lights flickering past them. Eventually, he pulled into a quiet overlook, the skyline stretching before them. Callie stared out the window. You didn't have to do this. Yes, I did. She turned to look at him. Why? Felix leaned forward, resting his forearm on the steering wheel. Because I know you, Callie. I know when you're carrying too much, when you don't let yourself breathe. He gestured toward the view. So breathe. She stared at him, something inside her unraveling. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. Felix reached over, taking her hand in his. Then let me show you. And in that moment, Callie let go of the last of her resistance. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. Callie still struggled with letting someone in, and Felix still had a way of pushing past her defenses with effortless precision. But somewhere between late-night conversations and stolen moments in the middle of their busy lives, they found something neither of them had been looking for. Something real. One evening, as they sat on Felix's penthouse balcony, Callie leaned against the railing, staring out at the city. I used to think love was something that happened to other people, she said softly. Felix stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. And now, she turned in his embrace, meeting his gaze. Now, I think I was wrong. Felix brushed his thumb over her cheek, his voice a low promise. You were. And when he kissed her slow and deep, Callie knew there was no going back, not that she wanted to. Felix had never been one to second-guess himself. His entire life had been built on decisiveness, on knowing exactly what he wanted and taking the necessary steps to get it. But as he stood in his office, staring out over the city skyline, he found himself hesitating for the first time in years. Callie had changed everything. He had spent weeks carefully pulling down her walls, earning her trust and proving that he wasn't just another man passing through her life. But now that he had her, now that she had finally let him in, a new fear settled in his chest. What if he didn't know how to keep her? A firm knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called, turning to see his assistant, Daniel, stepping inside. There's someone here to see you, Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. Felix frowned. I don't have anything scheduled right now, Daniel hesitated. It's her father. Felix's entire body went still. Callie's father, Daniel gave a single nod. Yes, sir, he's waiting in the conference room. Felix didn't waste another second. He strode out of his office, his mind racing. Callie had mentioned her father only once in passing, and even then she had kept the details vague. From what he had gathered, they weren't close. When he entered the conference room, the man waiting for him was already seated, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He had Callie's sharp eyes, though his held a calculating edge that Felix didn't like. Felix closed the door behind him and took a seat across from him. "Mr. Westwood," he greeted, keeping his tone even. The older man studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "I assume you know who I am." Felix met his gaze without hesitation. "I know you're Callie's father, that's all that matters to me." Mr. Westwood let out a quiet scoff. "That's a dangerous mindset to have, Mr. Jameson." "I make it a point to know who is involved with my daughter." Felix leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly is your concern?" The older man exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the table. "Callie is focused, determined. She has spent years building a life for herself. The last thing she needs is a distraction." Felix's jaw tightened. "If you think I'm a distraction, then you don't know your daughter as well as you think you do." Mr. Westwood's gaze narrowed. "I know her well enough to know that relationships have never been a priority for her, and I find it hard to believe that's suddenly changed." Felix held back the sharp response that immediately came to mind. Instead, he exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "Callie and I are not something you get to analyze like a business deal. She's not a chess piece, and I have no intention of playing games with her." Mr. Westwood studied him for a long moment before leaning forward slightly. "You're a man who is used to getting what he wants. That much is obvious. But my daughter is different. She doesn't operate on the same rules as the women I'm sure you're used to." Felix's expression didn't waver. "I don't want her to." There was a beat of silence before Mr. Westwood finally leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Then I suppose we'll see how long that lasts." Felix didn't bother responding. Instead, he stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "If your goal was to warn me away, you've wasted your time." Mr. Westwood rose as well, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Consider it free advice, then." Felix walked out without another word. That evening, he picked Callie up from the hospital, his mind still replaying the conversation with her father. He had no intention of telling her about it, not yet. He wasn't going to let anyone plant doubts where none belonged. As she slid into the passenger seat, she let out a tired sigh. "Long day." Felix glanced at her, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Anything I can do?" She turned her head toward him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're already doing it." Felix felt something settle in his chest at her words. He drove them to his penthouse where a quiet dinner awaited them. As they ate, Callie let herself relax, her usual guarded nature softening in the dim lighting of his dining room. After dinner, they moved to the balcony, the city stretching out before them in a sea of lights. Callie leaned against the railing, her hair catching the soft breeze. "You're quiet tonight," she noted, glancing at him. Felix stepped closer. "Just thinking." She turned fully to face him, tilting her head slightly. "About what?" Felix hesitated for only a moment before reaching for her hand. "About how I've never met anyone like you." A quiet laugh escaped her. "I think you've said that before." "I mean it." He squeezed her hand gently. "Callie, I know you weren't looking for this, and I know you still don't know where it's going, but I do." She studied him, something unreadable in her expression. "And where is it going?" Felix stepped even closer, his voice unwavering. "Wherever you'll let it." Callie let out a slow breath, searching his eyes. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone like me." Felix brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. "I like a little danger." For the first time that night, she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're impossible," Felix smiled, "and you're worth it." She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped into him, resting her head against his chest. Felix wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Whatever doubts her father had planted in his mind, they vanished in that moment, because this was real. Felix wasn't a man who doubted his choices, But as he sat in the back of his car later that evening, staring at the city lights flashing by, he found himself grappling with something unfamiliar. Callie had let him in, piece by piece, but she still held a part of herself back. It was subtle the way she hesitated when he talked about the future, the way she changed the subject when things got too deep. Felix knew patience wasn't his strongest virtue, but for her, he was willing to wait. Still, the conversation with her father lingered in his mind. He had no intention of letting anyone dictate what he and Callie could be, but he also knew she had spent years building her life on her own terms. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel like he was imposing on that. The next evening, he walked into the hospital, cutting through the bustling lobby with purpose. He had called ahead, ensuring she was on break before making his way to the staff lounge. When he pushed the door open, he found Callie sitting at a small table, sipping from a disposable coffee cup, her shoulders slightly hunched from exhaustion. She looked up in surprise. "Felix," he set a small paper bag on the table in front of her. "Figured you could use something better than hospital vending machine snacks." Callie raised an eyebrow as she pulled out a neatly wrapped sandwich. "You bribing the cafeteria staff now? I have my ways." A small smile tugged at her lips as she took a bite. "You really don't have to do this." "I know," Felix said, watching her carefully, "but I want to." She hesitated, chewing thoughtfully before setting the sandwich down. "You're always doing things like this." Felix leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "It's just new," Felix exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Callie, do you ever wonder why you're so hesitant to let someone take care of you?" She stiffened slightly, but he didn't back down. "I don't mean that you need me to," he continued. "I know you're more than capable of handling your life, but sometimes letting someone in doesn't mean giving up control, it just means sharing the weight." Callie's fingers tightened around her cup. "I've never been good at that." Felix reached out, gently brushing his hand over hers. "Then let me teach you." She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a slow breath. "I don't want to lose myself in this." "You won't." Felix's voice was steady, unwavering. "I don't want to change who you are, Callie. I just want to be there while you keep being exactly who you are." Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something shift. A quiet acceptance, a loosening of the grip she had on her own fears. She sighed, shaking her head. "You make it sound so easy," Felix chuckled softly. "It's not, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." Callie took another bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly before finally speaking again. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Not when it comes to you." She looked at him, something warm flickering in her gaze. Then, without another word, she reached across the table, lacing her fingers through his. And Felix knew in that moment that he had won something far more valuable than any deal he had ever closed. Weeks passed, and the shift between them became undeniable. Callie no longer hesitated when he reached for her hand. She didn't shy away when he spoke about the future. Felix had never been the kind of man to second-guess his feelings, and now, as he stood outside a small jewelry boutique, he knew exactly what he wanted to do next. Inside, he examined the rows of engagement rings, each one glittering under the soft lights. He had never pictured himself as the kind of man who would agonize over something like this, but when it came to Callie, every choice felt significant. He wanted the perfect one, and when he found it a delicate design with a brilliant cut diamond, he knew. He had always played his life like a chessboard, always thinking 3 moves ahead, but this wasn't strategy, this was certainty. That evening, he picked Callie up and drove her to a private garden overlooking the city. Twinkling lights hung from the trees, casting a soft glow over the stone pathway. Callie glanced around, curiosity flickering in her expression. "What is all this?" Felix reached for her hand, guiding her to the center of the clearing. "Something I've been planning for a while." She tilted her head, amusement in her eyes. "Felix, are you about to?" Before she could finish her sentence, he dropped to one knee. Callie's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. Felix looked up at her, his voice steady. "I've spent my whole life knowing exactly what I want, and then you walked into it and changed everything. You made me want things I never thought I needed." Callie's eyes shimmered under the lights. "I don't want to spend another day without you," he continued. So, Callie Westwood, will you marry me? For a moment she was completely still. Then a brilliant smile broke across her face. Yes, she whispered. Felix slid the ring onto her finger, rising to his feet just in time for Callie to throw her arms around him. He held her tightly, breathing her in, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own. When she pulled back, she glanced at the ring, then back at him. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? Felix chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Not when it comes to you. She kissed him then, slow and deep, and Felix knew this was the best deal he'd ever made. The wedding was everything they hadn't planned. Small, intimate, surrounded by only those who truly mattered. Callie wore a simple yet elegant white dress, her eyes shining as she walked toward him. Felix felt something tighten in his chest as she reached him, her hands slipping into his. When the officiant spoke, Felix barely heard the words. All he could focus on was her, the way she looked at him as if she had finally let herself believe this was real. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was firm, unwavering. I promise to stand beside you, to challenge you, to support you. I promise to love you the way you deserve with everything I have. Callie's grip on his hands tightened, her own vows just as steady. I promise to let you in, to trust you, to build something with you. I promise to love you without fear. And when they kissed, sealing the promises between them, Felix knew there was no hesitation left. She was his, and he was hers, completely.